We will be talking about 2 chapters in the Untracked book this morning titled Adjustments and Chicken or Egg. Before we get started into that, first of all, I want to thank each of you for taking time out of your schedules, especially on a holiday weekend, to join us on these Sunday mornings. We certainly appreciate you, not only the time, but also the comments and questions that you send in during the webinar as well as throughout the week. So thank you to each of you. A couple logistics before we jump into the content of the webinar. If you're not familiar with this platform, we have a moderated chat box over at the top right. Simply click in your comments or questions at the bottom of that little window. Click the send button, and then Ben and I will see that at our end, and we'll certainly share that or address it as needed on the webinar. And don't hesitate to do that because we love interaction, so we certainly invite you to participate that way. The other way to participate is also, if you want to do it more verbally, there is Ask a Question button below the video. Simply click on that. We'll get a notification at the end, and then at the appropriate time, we will turn the mic over to you, and you can share your question verbally versus typing it in the chat box. So whichever preference you would like to do, that works for us. All right, let's go ahead and get started into content. I found this week's readings interesting, and I think some of the ideas that come out of this reading are things that I really started to question in some ways when I was very young in life, and in other ways more recently, especially after I met Ben and Brenda a number of years ago now. But I wanted to share maybe more personal experience of how this applied to my life as I was growing up. In the first chapter we read, actually both chapters kind of pertain to this, but particularly the first chapter, it was about, it's called Adjustments, but it was about the idea of oftentimes things are initially opposed or ridiculed, and then opposed, and then finally accepted. And one of the applications of that, or on a personal level in my own life, was growing up in a kind of a religious culture that really did not invite women to participate fully or really to contribute or speak out. There were certain roles or certain jobs they could do that were very okay, but as far as leading or giving input into maybe some certain types of decisions, they were discouraged to share in that. That was more of a man's role. And I remember as a very young girl, it didn't feel right on the inside. Isn't that interesting? I think maybe it's, as children we sense it, but at that age we certainly can't put words to it. And it was just an example of something within that culture that was opposed, that eventually in my own heart I was able to accept. And as I was in that scenario, and as I got older, I realized, I do have something to contribute, I do have something to share, and I do have thoughts about different things, and they're valuable. And that's true with any of us. Our thoughts count, and the things we share are certainly valuable. And I was eventually able to work through that, maybe that guilt feeling. And part of that helped with that was, of course, my parents helped with that. They weren't quite as maybe restrictive as maybe some of the others within that religious culture. And eventually I came to the point where I accepted that women are valuable, and we do have something to share, and we can bring in another perspective that's often needed in scenarios. So that's just an example of maybe more of a personal application, and I may share more with some other things that I have walked that I thought about as I read this content. Then the second chapter was about chicken or the egg, and about institution versus the people is the term I would put. But I think Ben's going to share more about both of those chapters. So I'll turn it over to Ben, and he'll share his thoughts in these chapters as we discuss the topics. Go ahead, Hun.
Thank you, Karma. It is fascinating to me. I've loved this Arthur Schopenhauer quote for quite a number of years now. It was first given to me by Bill Reed. I'd never read any of Arthur Schopenhauer's work before that time, and I'll never forget seeing it for the first time and thinking, oh my goodness, uh, that's too close to the truth for comfort, because everything I had faced in ministry, and every time I would come with a big idea, it would go through this very process, and I could look back historically and see all of the things that had gone through that process. We can see that clearly in our own culture. Um, this the whole idea of slavery, say, that was accepted by us in our early years, um, as just normal and part of what life was all about. And you had slaves, or and I look back in my own history, and apparently way back along the line there was a colonel in the Revolutionary War on my mother's side who had 100 slaves. Now, today I would consider that horrible, repugnant, but I'm certain at that time somehow it was justified. And living in that culture would have been very different. I know Georgetown University right now is going through this, and I admire what their president is doing, in attempting to make right the wrong of a religious institution at that time, a Jesuit institution that had sold slaves, and for the dollars that were in it, and now attempting to give restitution to 200 years later to the descendants of those that were sold. And what an incredible thing it is when truth comes, and um, first it's ridiculed. Somebody says we shouldn't own slaves, and it's ridiculed. And second, it's maybe violently opposed, and maybe even so much as putting us through war. It's so violently opposed. But then it comes to this place where it's accepted as self-evident that no, we shouldn't have slaves. Or why would we treat any person that way? But I can remember even as a youth reading one time, thinking that it would be worth it to at least get into the mind of these people so I would understand it and be able to talk to them. I read a Ku Klux Klan publication from beginning to end, a newspaper type publication. And uh, about two-thirds of the way through, I was aware that somehow I had even bought in a little bit to what they were saying, because I was trying to listen into their minds and see, and realizing the danger of how culturally we can come to accept something. And it's a subtle thing, but we accept it. And when we're faced with truth, it isn't always comfortable for us. It's easier for us to stay within that culture, and um, we watch it even in scripture. We watch it through history and what changes in a historic perspective. Um, Today, we don't consider it positive that um, a king would have 300 wives and 700 concubines, but Solomon did, and David had many, and oftentimes there would be multiple wives. But today we would look down at that. We make laws against that. And you see the different kinds of changes. You can follow them even scripturally. So you can see changes that come out of the New Testament, and things that wouldn't be acceptable today that were acceptable in the culture of that time. And so we look at this and we see this need that we have to have somebody rise up who would be the optician that would look and say, maybe we ought to look at this differently, because I don't think we're seeing the perspective correctly. And these two chapters, to me, are their attempt is to show the subtleness, and there will be a little more of that in the next couple of chapters as well. But they they attempt to show the subtleness of what we just come to accept in our institutions and in the thought process that come out of them. And I want you to see something. Institutions themselves are soulless. They don't have souls. It's the people within that do. But we tend to buy into institutional thought. And that comes because we simply have grown up around it. We simply have listened to it over and over, and pretty soon we don't see the little things that are left out that are so important to us. And that leads us to the second piece that in the second chapter that I would like us to get to, because I think it is the most basic of all ways that religion doesn't let us follow Jesus. And Jesus faces it in his time. And as he points it up, it's what gets him crucified. And so we need to face it today as well. It's this subtleness of the institution taking precedence over the people. It becomes more powerful in its needs and in its demands than the very demands around us of poverty, of hurt, of pain, of all the things that we need to look at and say, that person needs me. And what happens is the whoever's get lost in the institutional thought. Now, let me give you some examples of that. Um, as a pastor, one of the great frustrations you face is that you usually go into pastoring because of this love for people and wanting to give yourself away to people and to be able to make a change in their lives and to be able to lead them to Christ and make a difference in people's lives. But the system takes us somewhere different than that. What happens is it becomes all about survival of an institution. So it becomes ultimately important that we keep the church going. Now, the church not as the people, but as the institution. And of course, we have all the thought processes out of that as well. Well, if we don't keep it going, where will the people come? So the thought processes lead us to all kinds of things that I suggest to you are really wrong directions to take scripture. So let's one illustration of that um, is we've heard many times you should be at church. You should be there. Don't forsake the assembling of yourselves to scripture to assembling yourselves together because scripture says that. And we take a passage totally out of its context and use it that way. Where what really is being benefited is the institution of the church. And we keep saying to people, you need to be here. It's what God intended that you come to church on Sunday, as if we always had church on Sunday and we always had buildings like we have and we always had staffs like we have and programs like we have and so the whole goal of the people is that you keep the church going. And the way you keep the church going is you come to church. Do you see how subtle a change that is? That isn't for the good of the people. That's for the good of the institution. Because we need people there. And as you will hear in a later chapter, we need nickels and we need noses to make institutions work. So those nickels and noses happen to be the dollars you have in your pocket and you being there. So thus the rise of the megachurch. What's a successful what's successful Christianity? Big churches? Because big churches point to great programs and they point to big staffs and they point to success and a success culture. But in reality, is that what Jesus was about? No, he was about a lady that was at a well one day at an odd time of day because she was kind of ashamed of who she was, probably. He was about a little short tax collector that climbed in a tree hoping to get a look at him. He was about a lady of ill repute at the time that needed him. He was about some fishermen who he saw incredible potential in. You know, it kind of reminds me last night we went to a Rockies game that we'd gotten tickets for, and there was a young gentleman that he and I don't know, probably girlfriend, because I saw them later holding hands as they walked off, but had gotten on the light rail that we were on, and they sat down together, and I noticed them, and so on, and a stop or two later, two older ladies had gotten on the light rail, and the one I I got up before she turned toward us, and I got up and gave her my seat because the light rail was getting quite full, and just a few moments later, I noticed that this young man had gotten up. He was sitting, and he had allowed, not only allowed, but had asked this other lady, that older um, lady, if to take the seat he had next to his girlfriend. And so I just, when we got off the light rail, we both got off at Union Station downtown, and I just nudged him and I said, "Thanks. You are a true gentleman. Thank you for doing that." Because you made her feel important and you made her feel cared for. And what an incredible thing that is. And that's what God sees and what He wants. He wants those that have gone through pain or are getting older or are struggling in some way to feel loved, wanted, accepted, cared for. And He really doesn't care that our institutions are mega churches. He really doesn't care that we have big, beautiful buildings. Those are unimportant to him. So unimportant. I don't imagine he's up there thinking, oh, how terribly unimportant they are. He's more thinking in terms of there's a little boy down the street and his mother has to work to keep things going. And he comes home from school, and the best thing in the world would be somebody who gives him cookies and milk and just sits and listens to his story and talks to him and laughs, and that he has kids to play with. And he has a healthy view of who he is. And he feels encouraged in life and feels like he can dream a little. Or he sees a older couple who both now have difficulty getting around. And he sees a young man who comes walking up to the car that they've just come from the grocery store in, and sees the young man helping them carry their groceries in. And laughter and smiling, and he sees the young mother whose husband has left, and now she doesn't have any good way to support the whole family, and he sees the family that takes note of it and pays for her schooling, takes care of the kids. He sees the village that has so much potential, but they don't have the resources internally to reach their potential, and he sees a farmer who steps in and says, "Let me help you find that potential. Let me show you how to till the ground." He sees those things, and that's what's important because they're part of the whoever's. God so loved the world He didn't say, I love institutions. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son so that we could have something to believe in. We believe in him because he believes in us. And whoever's the important thing. The subtleness of our institutions is that they turn everything around. And what happens is now we begin to say, can that person make our institution better? Instead of, how do we live to make life better for the people around us that God gives us? What an incredible thing that is. So for a prostitute who now breaks the bottle of perfume and washes Jesus' feet with the tears from her eyes, we don't really want her in our churches necessarily. She probably will do the wrong things. We maybe don't want the party goers of Matthew's tax collecting friends because they're not necessarily good for the institution. It just doesn't seem that Jesus makes that important at all. In fact, he walks through the institutional temples and overturns the tables because they've taken away the heart of God. Now they're thieves and now they're robbers. I think that's what institutions do to us. They rob us of the most important things there are. And we have to be very, very careful with that. And we need to step in occasionally and with a checking of our vision to see if we're seeing that. Do you have any questions or comments about that? I think the chapters coming up are going to take us to some possible solutions to that. Some ideas that I have that I just want to have out there, not that my ideas get followed, but that maybe they can trigger a whole bunch of ideas. That's the hope. Ideas in you of how we could carry out what Jesus seemed to come to do. Any thoughts, any questions?
I think one of the questions, and I think you and I had talked about this as I processed this information in these couple of chapters, there was a question inside of me about, because I used to not think like I do now. I used to be on the bandwagon of maybe the mega churches and was okay with that and was okay moving forward with that and was excited about moving forward with that. But then there was a sudden change in my life which me out of that scenario. And that's also when I met you and Brenda. And then my perspective of all that changed. Plus, you being a pastor, I saw another side of the whole thing. And so my ponderings were, how do we make sure our vision is what it should be? Because when we're in that scenario, we're blinded. We don't know that it's kind of off. And when you and I were talking earlier, the other thing I did in the midst of pondering that was, what are things that have happened in my own life that have maybe changed my vision or kind of changed that bandwagon thinking and made me take a step back? And I would say there were, besides meeting you and Brenda, so I think God places people in our paths to help us with that, especially if that's our heart intent. And the other thing that I've walked at has changed my vision to be more open, more accepting, more embracing, less judgmental is walking the grief process. I've lost several individuals close to me in a short time span, and that forced me, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but that gave me the opportunity to realize some of the cliches we say to people that are grieving and in the midst of hurting, saying things like, well, that's God will, or God knows best, or God never gives us anything too hard. Wow, those those just don't resonate when you're in the grieving process. I'd much rather have somebody just come sit with me silently and just be with me.
Mhm.
So I think maybe there's, if the heart is there to walk as Jesus walked, and if we're concerned about being blinded in the midst of what we're embracing, I think God allows things to cross our paths to maybe help adjust our vision a little bit. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts with that or not.
I really agree with that. And I think one of the wonderful things that we can learn to do is accept this idea that we can grow and become more like Jesus all the time, and that the circumstances of life can cause us to look at it. You know, the institutional view of that is that we have to believe a certain way. So oftentimes our platitudes and our little things that we say come out of a rigid view of who God is, you know, how he reacts and how he responds to people and how we ought to respond. And you know, I would want to encourage everyone, don't be quick to say things using God. God told me this, or the Bible says, or those kind of things. I think it would be far better if we would just say, you know, I've grown. See this. I think it would please God maybe if I just saw things differently than I do now. I look at things and I think, man, I don't think I've ever been a prejudiced person. However, there's probably a lot of ways that I have. And I look at life and I say, instead of just saying, well, I've got this figured out or here are the answers, I look at the situation now and I look at our country and the turmoil it's in this presidential race and what it's showing up and during a time when there's terrorism all over the world and the fears that we have inside and what it leads us to wanting our own safety at any cost, and sometimes it extends to this place where we now start legitimizing how we feel, and we will find a way to use scripture to legitimize that. I think if we can look around us and say, I want to become more like Jesus. I want to do things that would please the Father. And we look at our own lives and we say, how would I like my kids to turn out? Do I want them to be courageous? Or do I want them to live just safely? No, of course I want my kids to live safely. But ask the question deeply. Would I rather they be safe, or would I rather they be truly courageous people? I think most of us would say down deep, I want them to be courageous people. I want them to do things that are difficult and strong, sometimes tough to deal with. Do I want them around? Of course I do. But I think so many times it's a subtle little thing. It's a subtle change, and we need to let the things around us change us. So when I see, um, I hear these crazy statements, and one might be this white privilege statement. I'm white, so I'm privileged. Well, it's true, and that truth is not necessarily comfortable if I'm white, because I would like to think that I'm not a prejudiced person. But white privilege has created some things for me that make it so that my black brothers and sisters don't get some of the benefits that I've had. And so, what needs to change? And I want to look at life like that. I don't want to look at it always from just my um, comfort position, but more difficult positions. Let it change me. Let it change me for the better to become like Christ.
And I think to add to that, and this is also just part of the things that we talked about yesterday as we were kind of reviewing this material, which I thought was a very good point, is as a society, we tend not to let things go or let things die
Yeah.
or let things just be for a season. And it's made me even think about some things in my life that maybe I need to let go because there was a season for that, but now it's a different season. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
and you and I have walked that in other ways as well. But I think the idea of maybe even churches
Mm-hmm.
or certain churches for a season and letting them pass on. Maybe you can share more thoughts about that as well.
That's an interesting thing, and that from a pastoral standpoint, it was an issue for me to deal with in leadership in the denomination that I was part of. The whole idea that we ought to let institutions die like people die. All of us die. We're going to face that. We are not going to get out of here alive. And institutions we need to have the same thoughts about, but we don't let them die. In our culture, institutions, we do everything we can to make them survive. We try to keep them going no matter what. And that also is a tremendous influencer in the way we think often. So we don't just allow things to die. Number one, we've put a lot of investment into them. What do we do with our churches? We build buildings. Buildings are fairly permanent structures. And sometimes those structures, our cathedrals and our big fancy buildings are quite permanent. And not only are the buildings themselves permanent, but the whole idea of success in our culture means that we can't let something die readily. You know, we'll fight to keep it going. But there are seasons of time when there were great uh, ideas and ministries and and even a need for buildings and those type of things. And but sometimes we need to see that they are not what we're here to keep surviving. What we're here to do is to bring life to people, not to keep institutions going, but to bring life to people. What a difference that is. And it's a hard thing for us to move to those thoughts often. Any other thoughts or comments this morning?
I
It's,
think I'll just add as we probably kind of wrap up for the morning, and that is we kind of want to um, wrap up these webinars on answering the question of what do we do with this? What difference does this make in our own lives as we go forward out into the next week? What we do with this information that we've discussed? And I think from this morning's discussion, and as Ben has iterated several times throughout the past 35 minutes or so, is allowing things in our lives to change us and maybe pondering is what is it that needs to change in my life as I walk this journey out as unexpected events or expected events occur in our life, being open to change. And I think also the another question in that Ben had mentioned too is begin to ponder, is what's happening around me or is what I'm being told, is it more of an institutional thing versus is it really caring for the people? And just to become aware of that and to let those questions and that process and maybe even the doubt, maybe even some fear about it all, um, be okay in the midst of that. It reminds me of one of the questions in the discussion book was, what do we think of the quote about truth being ridiculed, violently opposed, and then accepted? I think, what does that show about us? And I think it shows the fear that we often live in fear of things not being like we expect them to be, or things not being like we believe they are. But I think learning to live in maybe somewhat doubt um, helps keep our vision clearer and being willing to ask those questions.
Yes. I think we live in an incredible time with a lot of opportunity and a lot of changes in the way people think. And I think this is an opportunity for us to relook at things. It's time that we maybe look and see whether we are seeing clearly through the lenses we're looking through. And maybe if there are some places we need to get the eternal optician to look and say, we need to change this. You're trying to hold that book too far away from your eyes now. We need to change the way we're looking at this. And let him help us see better, see differently than we have been. Thanks for being part of this. Love doing this, and I trust that it makes a difference in your lives. And I hope that the conversation begins to rise in ways that make the changes that are needed. Thanks again.
And just to reiterate our schedule, we will not be on next week. We'll be out of town, so we'll be skipping a week. So the following week, which is September 18th, I believe, we'll be covering, I believe, the next two chapters in the book, titled How is Christianity Influenced by Capitalism? And then another chapter called Trust. So we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. That will actually wrap up part 3 of the book, and we'll go into part 4 of the book after that. So again, thank you all for joining us. As we've said many times, we certainly appreciate it. That appreciation never ceases, and we appreciate you taking time as well as participating and giving us questions and comments either during the webinar or through the emails that you have sent us as well. So again, enjoy your Labor Day weekend, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.